Right. Giving people a few minutes to get joined here. And we can go ahead and get started. Well, we'll let people in that are a little late to getting maybe having that Zoom update that pops up and happens to us all at various times or maybe don't want it. Good morning. I'm Tracy Trix Matthews, and I'm the Associate Director in the Ackerman Center for Excellence in Sustainability. And this is our next coaching session with Victor Primov, who is joining us today from Bulgaria. And he's going to do a presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A. So glad that you all could join this. This is also being recorded, so you can go back and refer to this afterwards a little bit later. So thanks for joining, and I will go ahead and let Victor get started.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Victor Primov. A little bit of background about me. I spent the last 16 years in project financing in emerging markets. I've worked in credit origination, portfolio management, and I've certainly worked in social impact investments on both the credit desks of the USDFC and other institutions. Tracy asked me to put together this presentation. I know that usually there are a lot of questions about what is blended finance. So I've put together a few slides, and I'd love to have your questions after that, but I just wanted to give everyone an overview as to what is blended finance. If you know, great, but it seems like every year there's a lot of confusion as to what it is, and I think a few people get hung up on the blended concept. I also would like to point out that I've been a judge at the various competitions that the center has put together for the last few years. Tracy and Jeff put these fantastic competitions together, and I'm really glad to be part of those. So can everyone see my screen? Yep, perfect. Okay, so what's blended finance? Typically, that's a combination of grants from organizations like USAID, USDFC, USTDA, and others, as well as international foundations such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations. You also have technical assistance from the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the U.S. Department of Energy and Agriculture, USAID, as well as pretty much any U.S. or other international government departments. A type of assistance is also volunteer resources, such as Habitat for Humanity, Hafer International, USAID, and of course, equity from private investors, foundations, as well as the US government. And of course, debt, which can come in the form of loans, as well as project finance from large international development finance institutions like USDFC, the Dutch FMO, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and many others development-focused institutions. So why do we need it? Grants help us pay for feasibility study and environmental impact studies, as well as local labor studies. And the reason they can be incredibly helpful is that if we have a concept that we're going for funding and we would like someone to invest in it, one question we're definitely going to come up against many times is, Is this a viable idea? Has anyone done this before? Am I investing in a startup or am I investing in proven technology? What are the risks? What do I need to worry about as an investor? Are there a number of these ideas, or is your idea unique? How is it unique? Are you using new technology? Are you using existing technology in a new way? Or is this so far out there that I, as an investor, am not comfortable in taking this risk? Whereas if you have a feasibility study that you're able to get a grant on, you're able to convince a lot of these investors that you're using maybe a proven idea in a new way, or in a slightly different way, so that they can become more comfortable in funding your idea. Because if a lot of times, if your idea is not viable, the investors will say, well, no, thank you. So the grants help us make feasibility studies that make us the business case to get investors a little more comfortable. And that's one example. We need to look at all of these elements so that we can reduce our risk, so we can reduce the investor risk, and so we can look at taking our startup from concept to full scale. Also, a lot of these blended finance mechanisms, such as technical and volunteer resources, they can be very helpful to us because we don't have all the answers. And maybe we need a little direction, or we need some technical expertise. Maybe we need a structural engineer or environmental engineer for a concept, but we're not able to hire one, so we can apply for technical assistance or to get someone to volunteer to help us. All of these are examples of blended finance. All of these can help us make money for us and for our idea, as well as we can use all of them to meet the UNDP Sustainable Development Goals. So here are a few resources that you guys may want to look at. I would strongly recommend looking at the USDFC's completed transactions. It shows you what was financed, where, what was the scope, and you might get a little blurb about the terms of the deal. The USDFC finances debt and equity in emerging markets, and they may consider startup ideas. The World Bank is an absolutely a fantastic resource, and you've got to be pretty specific because it has a lot of resources, as well as really useful templates, agreements, research, and so you could spend a lot of time on that. Depending on your idea, you may need an environmental impact as well as a feasibility study if you're trying to attract investors. And I've put an example as to what those may look like. And if you're at all interested in Power in Africa, there's a great program called Power Africa that has examples of transactions that have been financed. These include projects that are microgrids on the village and the community level, and other examples of social impact investments. So here's an example of a blended transaction. So this is a small, I would consider $20 million a small transaction, and it's a microgrid project in Africa. So here's an example of the blended part. We've had 3 million in grants from USAID, USTDA, and USDFC. These were used to do the bankable feasibility studies to show that the concept is viable. It's not just charity, it will actually pay for itself, and there will be a return on investment. There was a technical assistance from the US Department of Energy, where they asked about how to do a microgrid, and the US Department of Energy sent a couple of experts to help out in this remote area. For the equity portion, they went to the Omidyar network, the Ford and the Gates Foundations, who invested in this project. And then the debt was through the USDFC and Dutch FMO. That was, since you have more than one lender, that's known as a debt syndication. Political risk insurance was covered by USDFC, and that is that's very important and that's to make investors whole if there is any kind of political instability or anything happens to the project. The political risk will repay the debt and the equity investors in full. So that's pretty important. And last but not least, currency hedging solutions, and that is, in very simple terms, we're fixing the exchange rate between the US dollar and the local currency, because we're repaying the debt in US dollars, but our project revenues are in local currency, which can be pretty unstable. So with that, we have taken out a lot of risk of this project that was now funded. And so all of these things that you see, the grants, the technical assistance, the equity, the debt, political insurance, and the currency hedging, these are all examples of blended finance, where we're putting these things together and blending them to create a solution and get to a yes, and get to a $20 million in funding. Are there questions that I can help answer on this? Is there any slide that you would like me to go back to?
One question I have is, I feel like this is a topic, that has gotten more attention recently. So like, how do you see this? How do you see the space change, like, since you started your career and then to this point? Like, has it gotten easier to get certain funding, or like, kind of how has it developed, and how do you expect it to also change, like, moving forward?
Absolutely. And I'm really glad that you asked that question, Caroline, because when I started my career a long time ago, the concept of social impact investment was not really seen as a serious asset class. The attitude in investment banks, funding sources was like, oh, you want a project that wants to do good and make money? Well, that's nice. Good for you. Whereas now, and the response was, oh, so you want to build a well somewhere, and you want to give these people solar panels. That's great. That's really nice. So maybe you should ask an aid organization for that. But in terms of evolution, this is now a very serious asset class of social impact investments. They're to the point where even the likes of BlackRock and CalPERS and a lot of mega investors that are managing hundreds of billions of dollars are allocating serious funds to social impact and ESG investments, it's been absolutely incredible to see this kind of evolution from what I mentioned early to funding sources being pretty willing to consider this kind of project. And I'll mention something else. When Mohammed Yunus started Grameen Bank, people thought he was absolutely nuts to be lending money to poor people and to be lending a couple of dollars at a time. Well, Grameen Bank has been doing very well. It's lifted millions of people out of poverty. It's expanded worldwide, and it's been copied. The business model has been copied by a number of imitators. But when Mohammed Yunus started that, people thought he was crazy. So the whole asset class. So what's turned into a nice concept is actually a very serious asset class for serious investors who are looking to invest in this so they don't miss out. So I'm glad you asked that question. Maybe it's a longer answer than you wanted.
No, that was wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Feel free to use chat or go ahead and unmute and you can ask Victor whatever questions you might have.
Victor, I know you mentioned conducting feasibility studies. And I was curious if you might elaborate on that for folks that might not be as informed on the importance of that and kind of what that looks like in terms of the work that you do.
Sorry, just a second. Let me get the dog to stop barking.
You're good.
So be thinking of other questions to ask Victor. To get the dog settled. Thanks for your question, Victoria.
Sorry about that. Victoria, great question. So some examples of feasibility studies would be on the USDFC website, and I believe I have a link to that. Also, USTDA has a lot of examples of what bankable feasibility studies look like, as well as the World Bank. In terms of formatting, and so some of the key things that are covered in the feasibility studies are what is the project, what is the budget, what is the technology, is the technology viable, is it something that has been used before, is this a new concept, and depending on how specific it is, so if you're, for example, if you're doing a study on a microgrid project, then say it's powered by solar panels, then a feasibility study would go into how much does it cost and break it down in the categories of the cost of your solar panels, the inverters, the construction. It would go after, it would show the what planning is involved, and it would be very comprehensive and say, okay, you're comparing this kind of solar panel versus another one. You have an efficiency of X, and therefore, if you use this type of solar panel, your project would make more money over the, versus using the other competitor that you're considering. So these can be very comprehensive, and probably the best source for free feasibility studies is the USDFC and the World Bank Library and USTDA.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. Other
I just-
questions?
I just added that link in the chat as well for everyone. Can you talk a little bit about projects that you've worked on, and then maybe those things that were missed? You know, so like, what are some of the little pieces that are super important that tend to be kind of overlooked when projects are starting to come together? That might be an interesting way to look at it.
Absolutely, and let me go back to my example slides for an African transaction. And Tracy, I'm glad you asked this question. So I have worked across this on the infrastructure space, and I've also worked in the social impact space. When it comes to power projects in emerging markets, whether it's a microgrid or a utility scale, one of the things that people often forget is the currency hedging. And you might have a fantastic project that has great fundamentals, but then when the local revenue is in local currency and the debt is in US dollars and you haven't done this, there is a very real risk that due to whatever event, the currency goes down in relation to the US dollar, and they cannot afford to pay the project. That has been very common. Another social impact investment that I worked on was actually a remote education transaction in various parts of Africa, where effectively a group that has been running rural schools in Tanzania and Kenya and other places, they thought it'd be great to just, instead of having building all these physical schools, to have tablets and to have a digital school so that they can reach out more people. The project was very well thought out. They had the experience, they had everything else, but what they didn't realize is that by going from one or two schools to trying to reach dozens at the same time on tablets, they needed to seriously involve the local ministries of education in this discussion, who perceive this US NGO as competition. And this is in areas where private schools do not exist. So the ministries, because they were not involved in this, they were worried that the children will deviate from the national curriculum, and how do they get control and ensure that standards are met if they can't visit the actual classroom, and everything is being delivered remotely online on tablets, and so they didn't consider the local aspect of that. They didn't involve the local players. They didn't bring them along, and they try to go way too fast. So they were having problems with several African jurisdictions because they just wanted to do it, which is great, but the fact that they didn't invest in building those relationships with the local ministries of education meant that they had a lot of problems, in which also impacted their ability to repay the loans that they got from the USDFC to various extents. And had they spent the time to develop these relations and bring everybody along and maybe start a little smaller and a little slower, they would have had less problems. So these are two examples that I've seen in other circumstances, the one of the big problems with transactions is that not enough was paid to the needs of the local people. In terms of how many jobs are they getting, and the tendency in a lot of projects coming from Western organizations is to automate and bring all this heavy technology and to automate as much as possible. Well, that's great, but the locals need jobs. And so in certain cases, whereas you might be used to having something that is highly automated, you may want to adjust your expectations and make it a lot more manual, so that you're able to go into the community and you're able to create jobs. And so you'd have to adjust your process, because then you might have a fantastic idea, but if you have nothing for the locals, then that's a problem. And a good example of that actually is the Belt and Road Initiative, which is done by China, where they have create these grand infrastructure projects all over the place, in Africa, South America, Central Asia, etc. But the problem is they bring Chinese workers, Chinese equipment, Chinese materials. The locals end up agreeing to accept the debt, but then they don't get the jobs, which is leading to a pretty big backlash across China and a lot of developing markets, because a lot of these projects are being presented that these are gifts from the Chinese people, which is not the case. These are loans. But then nobody other than the Chinese get to work on them, so there's no money going into the economy. And so people were understandably unhappy about that. So think about the locals, think about what they need, think about do they have solutions and ideas that can complement your idea, that can be very beneficial. Don't do like the Chinese do on the Belt and Road Initiative. Other questions?
Very quiet this morning.
One question I have is, for like, okay, blended finances, like obviously combining all these types of money or funding to get private funding and saying like, hey, investors, like you will get your money back to like de-risk it. But I was kind of wondering, as a project financer, like what are the other aspects that you have to have secured, I guess, to convince private investors, like, okay, having this other public money or different types of money, but then you talked about feasibility studies. Are there other aspects that are like crucial to convincing those private investors?
Absolutely, and I'm glad you asked that question. So, you're certainly looking at the legal structures, and in terms of protecting your investors and making and typically in project finance, you have some kind of a bankruptcy remote vehicle, and you're effectively giving investors control over the bank accounts, because if you don't comply with the debt covenants, they lock up your bank account, and they don't have to worry about repossessing or running your project somewhere and trying to sell it. Of course, you'd be giving them those creditor rights, where they known as step-in rights, curing rights where they have the right in theory to step in and take over your project. But in reality, in my 16 years of practice and several hundred projects funded around the world, I've only had to exercise my lender step-in rights twice. And one was to take over or threaten to take over a refinery in Nigeria. But believe me, as a creditor, the last thing I wanted to do was to repossess a refinery in Nigeria and run it when I lived in London. So the other aspect of that is covered by serious legal agreements. And depending on where your project is, there may be resources on those legal agreements. For example, the African Development Bank has a legal facility for development projects in Africa specifically, which is quite significant because some of those legal fees can be pretty expensive. And you need to factor in the legal fees and everything else into any kind of budget that you have for the project, just like with salaries, materials, etc. But when you're stepping in the room with the investors, you need to have those in place, and you need to have a legal team that has your back, so that things are a bit more balanced. So these are absolutely critical. I would suggest looking at the World Bank resources for examples of some of these legal agreements, which would have in the power sector would be things like power purchase agreements, offtake agreements. I would also strongly recommend that you look at the African Development Bank's legal facility if you're looking at projects in Africa, just to get an idea as to what you're looking in these agreements. And so all the debt covenants, all the provisions on things like debt service coverage ratios, these would all be included in your cash flow model. They may also be included in your bankable feasibility study, depending on how skilled the entities doing the study are. Does that help?
Yes, very much so. Thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions? Shy group.
Oh, they're so quiet. Good questions so far, though. And, think about, you may think that your question is not really relevant, but it's probably something that others are thinking about as well. So, do ask while we have Victor on the line right now. I'll also go ahead and remind everyone that the platform that we use where you submit your proposals is open, and I put the link in the chat. So you can go ahead and start submitting what you have. You don't have to have it completely finished, but it's a good idea to get your account set up and to get that started. There have been teams that waited until 11:59 p.m. to submit when it's due, that closes at midnight, and then had some technical issues. So I would suggest that you do that earlier than the last minute. So that is open and available for you to start submitting. We will have more coaching sessions. We have another one next Tuesday, I believe, on the 16th. Let me double check that. That you all should have been invited to. Yes, 16th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But any other questions for Victor about blended finance, the structure, things you need to think about, your proposals?
Maybe I can give you guys some suggestions, and full disclosure, I'm judging this, so these are very general tips that apply across all of your ideas. So one thing to think about is think about your investors, and think of your idea as not just an idea for the competition, but you're going in front of investors. Actually, most of our fellow judges are investors, bankers, lawyers who work in this field. And so we get to make these decisions every single day as to whether we fund something or not. And so the more compelling, the more clear it is, the more articulated your points are, the better for you, and the tougher for us, because every year we see a lot of really good ideas, and it is a lot of times it is very, very tough to award someone to be a winner, which is fine. But I would also encourage you to think about the fact that even if you don't win the competition, go ahead and start. If you think this is a great idea, go ahead and start approaching investors. And there is a lot that's written online in terms of how do you get investors to yes, and what are the things that VCs and angel and accelerators and others look for. So go ahead and consult these resources, because if you think about the judges as investors who are getting a lot of good ideas, but only a couple of them can be funded, that would be a useful mindset for you to have.
Nice.
Other things that can help with, ask away.
Yeah. Feel free to ask about the logistics of the challenge, or things about blended finance. You just did such a great job. You covered it all, Victor.
Thank you. Well, I'm happy to take other questions. If you guys think of anything, Tracy is welcome to share my email. Send me an email, and I'm happy to answer general questions, but I cannot give you tips on specific project ideas because I'm judging this year.
Thank you for that. All right, well, we can go ahead and we'll stop recording.